Okay, so we're going to start by talking about cystic fibrosis. And it wasn't until about 30 or maybe less years ago that we didn't know exactly what was the gene that causes cystic fibrosis and where exactly what chromosome carried that gene. Nowadays, biologists, cell biologists, geneticists know exactly where this gene that causes cystic fibrosis is located. And any gene that we have in the human body actually that causes whatever, we know where it can be found because the entire human genome has been sequenced. It means that we know every gene on every chromosome and where to find them. So that's why in the book you'll be reading that the gene for cystic fibrosis, and there's an abbreviation for it, and it's found in this particular location. Now there's a recessive version of that gene and there's a dominant version of that gene. When you have alternative versions of a gene, there's a word for that. I want all of you to show me that you're present today by going now on Hangouts and typing for me what is one word for the alternative forms of a gene. One word for the alternative forms of a gene, please. So, Hangouts, one word. Leonica, correct and present. Leah, correct and present. So, alternative forms of the gene are referred to as alleles. So, with respect to cystic fibrosis, it's been understood that people can be carriers of cystic fibrosis. What do we mean by somebody is a carrier of cystic fibrosis? Because in the book it says 1 in 20 people in certain parts of Europe have the allele that can cause cystic fibrosis. Having that allele it can't possibly be that 5% of the population's got this debilitating disease, right? So 1 in 20 people are referred to as carriers of cystic fibrosis. And that's what the book says. According to the book, it's 1 in 20 individuals in certain parts of Europe carry the allele for cystic fibrosis. What exactly does that mean? Write a sentence for me now, please, explaining what does it mean to say that a person is a carrier of the cystic fibrosis allele. What does that mean? So checking on Hangouts to see answers again.
Sir, could you repeat the question?
What does it mean? Who's this? Aryav?
Yeah.
Yeah, Aryav, what does it mean to say a person is a carrier of cystic fibrosis? So the carrier means that a person has one of their alleles being the dominant allele, which gives them no symptoms of cystic fibrosis. So whatever all of the symptoms are about certain ducts and tubes having a very high mucus, a thick mucus that makes you susceptible to infections and disease and things like that, that presence of a dominant ensures that that condition doesn't develop. But the carrier is the individual who has a dominant and a recessive. And this individual is referred to as heterozygous. Homozygous means having both alleles the same. Heterozygous having different alleles. So all of these vocabulary terms are so important in genetics because questions now in exams and then in the future when you guys go on further, questions are not going to say, this is the genotype of an individual. It would say, an individual heterozygous for cystic fibrosis. Okay? So an individual who's heterozygous for cystic fibrosis has a partner who is also heterozygous for cystic fibrosis. Okay? So these are the two genotypes I've written here. When we say that the person doesn't have cystic fibrosis, then we are describing the phenotype. All of this was given to you guys on the lesson with mice. All of these vocabulary terms, I address them by speaking about it with respect to coat color in mice. Mice having the spotted coat or the solid coat. I deliberately pointed out that I don't want to speak about it with tongue rolling, and non-roller and roller, and earlobe and widow's peak, and whole range of fake human genetics traits, what we call the myths of human genetics, something that I know we've discussed before. So, normal Mendelian patterns of inheritance are not that easy to find in humans, but it so happens that cystic fibrosis is inherited in a normal Mendelian way, actually. There's a dominant and there's a recessive. So, I want you guys to draw a full Punnett square diagram. And when I say full, I don't just want 4 boxes with letters. Students easily split this up and they put 2 letters there and they put 2 letters there. But I want annotations showing me what are the genotypic ratios and what are the phenotypic ratios of the offspring. Okay? So I want you to give me a genetic diagram, or a Punnett grid as it's called. And on it, I would like you to annotate and explain to me what is the genotypic ratio from this cross. I mean, calling it a cross when you're dealing with humans, it's a word that we try to avoid. But let's just call it that. What are the genotypic ratios if these 2 individuals have offspring? And what are the possible phenotypic ratios? I want you to draw a genetic diagram or a Punnett grid and annotate for me, please. What are the genotypic and phenotypic ratios? So you're doing that right now. If there are any questions, let me know. Yes, Kamicha, I'm only seeing your phenotypic ratio given there, though. What you're giving me is not your genotypic ratio. Really for the benefit of those who didn't quite get what we mean by the genotypic and phenotypic ratios. So these are the 2 ways, or the ways of representing the genotypes of the parents. What this means really, when you do this, when you put 2 letters, is that each letter represents an allele or a form of a gene that is passed to the individual by one of their parents. So let's say this individual here had a blue parent and a black parent. The blue parent might have given the big C and the black parent might have given the little c. So they've got these 2 forms of a gene, these 2 alleles. When this individual is about to engage in sexual reproduction, a gamete has to be made, a sex cell, which is a sperm cell or an egg cell. Only one of these 2 could be passed on to the offspring. Only 1 out of every 2 alleles in the genotype could be passed on. So every allele has an alternative. And only 1 of the 2 could be passed on. So when we draw the Punnett grid like this, and we say, okay, this is the male, and we put the male here, and that's the female, and we put the female here, we're saying that there is a possibility of this allele and this allele being passed on, and this one and this one. So what possible combinations then can we have? This is what the grid represents. So the lines, the letters, the single letters at the extremities of the box represent the gametes. That's what they actually represent, the gametes. And what we write in here are possible combinations in the offspring. So especially when you use a letter like C or S, it's really important that you are very clear for yourself what's the big and the little, so you don't get confused afterwards. And more importantly, the examiner doesn't get confused. So big C, little c, very clear. So what are the genotypic and phenotypic ratios? Well, genotypic means 1 homozygous for the dominant. You see this here? This is 1 homozygous for the dominant, 1 homozygous for the recessive, and 2 heterozygous. Heterozygous, a big and a little, just like the parents. Homozygous for the dominant, homozygous for the recessive. So your genotypic ratio is 1 to 2 to 1. Okay? 1 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygotes, 1 homozygous recessive. Your phenotypic ratio is 1 to 3. to 1. 3 individuals will have no symptoms of cystic fibrosis. Notice I deliberately want to avoid the word normal, because what that implies, in the way that we communicate, I want you guys to reflect on. The moment you are a genetic counselor or a doctor or someone giving a lecture, and you start speaking about normal people versus people with cystic fibrosis, it kind of puts a negative spin. Having cystic fibrosis does not mean you are abnormal. You have a genetic disease. It's a condition that you have, but you are still a normal human being. Everyone should be treated as a normal human being. So I deliberately want us to avoid talking about a normal male and a normal female. What you have is an individual who is free of cystic fibrosis. These are the ones with the dominant alleles. The ones that are homozygous for the recessive. They are patients of cystic fibrosis. They suffer from this degenerative disease where they are going to have very thick mucus and be susceptible to infections in their lungs and different systems in the body. Exactly what are the effects of being homozygous for this recessive allele? That's outlined clearly in the book, and you can look up and read all about cystic fibrosis.